You know, the State Department's been given a mission impossible, given the fact that the Department of Defense is not cooperating. And we know why. They don't want to leave. Why don't they want to leave? Well, you know, that's a subject for another hearing. I don't have anything more to say.
Thank you, gentleman, for his statement. Now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Luetkemeyer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The title of the hearing today is Transition Iraq, Is the State Department Prepared to Take the Lead? And in your summary, Mr. Thibault, you indicate that, well, you list a list of concerns here. Unknown contract and program support from the DOD, funding limitations likely to impact mission capability, the need to contract for and perform functions that have never been done by their department, and feel the department's been placed in an unfair position to be able to deliver on their mission. I guess my question is, you sort of prefaced in your summary here the reason for failure of the State Department to be able to lead and or its concerns about leading. And I wish you to elaborate on that, because I'd like to know, is the State Department prepared to lead in this?
Our assessment, my assessment, is they're prepared to lead if they must. Their preference is to do as has been discussed here earlier, which is those organizations that can best provide support would provide them the support. That's the request. And the request has, the point is the request has been out there almost 6 months. And so they're going with a dual approach of planning, which doesn't make a lot of sense to us, which is their approach is, if the Department of Defense gives us support, here's what we can do. But if they don't give us support, and they've begun solicitation planning to use contractors for the many items introduced in our statement and in our prior report, simply because they may not have a choice. And the points that have been made here, what we're trying to force out is a decision, and then a debate on that decision, and the decision just is not forthcoming.
Okay, so you've delineated the concerns and the problems, and obviously there's some give and take here on what's going on. Just let me back up a little bit to a couple things that during your testimony you raised some questions. One of the things you talked about was the MRAPs are going to be allowed to be used by the contractors. How much other equipment are we going to be leaving behind or reassigning to the contractors, or taking? Do we give up ownership of this as United States, or is it going to be ours and going to be utilized by the contractors? How does that work?
Right. This would be still government-owned equipment. The State Department provided a page-long, very detailed request for various equipment items, to include MRAPs and aviation transport and other types of critical equipment. That's also part of the request that's out there that hasn't been forthcoming. But the government would own it. But I think the example of Commissioner Green, MRAPs go where there's security issues.
Right.
Everyone here knows that there's a gunner on top of an MRAP. And the gunner's job is to provide safety. And we could say it's defensive, but it's really offensive. It's to take down insurgents. That's the great example of government-owned equipment that's going to be operated by contractors, unless this coordination process evolves into something more meaningful.
What do you believe the mission to be for the transition here over to the State Department? Do you believe it to be a military operation yet, or is it turned completely into a political operation, or is it a combination of both?
Well, I would say their mission that they would see is a diplomatic mission in an environment that's absolutely not secure. So by default, if they're providing all services, it has to be a combination of both. Okay.
Well, during your testimony, you also made a comment, something about the military was unable to respond to an attack under the new guidelines here. Did I misunderstand?
No, sir.
Okay. Can you elaborate on that just a little bit?
I'm drawing a blank on the military unable. Oh, what I would elaborate on in my testimony was that now, within 6 to 8 seconds, the military puts indirect fire on top of insurgents who mount rockets or mortars and the like. The State Department has said, well, we would have difficulty obtaining that service from contractors, and therefore we don't have any plans to replace it. The difficulty becomes is if you're one of the bad guys and there's no one raining fire down on your head immediately, you're liable to, rather than take one rocket and run, which is bad enough, you're liable to take many rockets and fire them all off into the area. And rockets are very random, and the potential for security risks are amplified.
The contractors don't have the ability to respond?
The contractors don't run indirect fire mortars. There's no experience in.
Okay, so our mission there then is it transitions over to the State Department would be less military then?
It would have to be the use of contractors if the military was not available to do counter battery. The only other option would be the Iraqi forces providing that support, but to date that's not considered an option.
Okay, I see my time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I recognize the gentleman from Massachusetts, Congressman Turney, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, gentlemen. When I wrote this bill that formed your Wartime Contracting Commission in the House with my colleague Jim Leach, Republican, and then Jim Webb took it up in the Senate, it was our intention to give you the authority to go in and look at just these types of matters. And I want to thank you for doing that. I wish we had gotten the bill, it was a bipartisan bill, through the House earlier, so you could have got an earlier start. But the important aspect of that was, in fact, identifying exactly what is an inherently governmental function, and then giving us a course of how to remedy the current situation. So I'm assuming that your report, either an interim report or a final report, is going to give us a path of a recommendation as to what are the inherently governmental functions, how we ought to get to the point where government does them, and then if the correct government agency can't do it immediately, then how we're going to arrange for a proper government agency to do it in the interim, and then have a path of training people and bringing people on board for the right government agency to eventually do those functions. And in the interim, if perchance some of it has to be done by contractors, and hopefully not, how they are going to get the right management and oversight personnel and the right number of them in place to carry out those activities with insight not just into the subcontract but the sub-subcontracts. That kind of insight has been terribly missing, like our Subcommittee on National Security and Foreign Affairs cited in the Warlord Inc. report for just one example on that. Am I right about this expectation for your report?
You're absolutely correct, Congressman.
Okay. Then I think we have here a real issue about funding on that. And the State has been hollowed out. I think you point that out very well on that. We've had a number of hearings in our subcommittee as well. Now, Secretary Gates has indicated in the past that he thinks he's going to save about $100 billion in his cuts in the Department of Defense on things that are redundant or ought not to be continued on. The problem, as I see it, is he's made some rhetoric in the past about thinking that the State Department ought to be beefed up. I would hope that your recommendations go as to how some of those savings for our national security interests would be transferred into the Secretary of State's agency to allow us to have a better national security posture by beefing up the Secretary of State. I don't know if you're going to go there or not, but I would recommend that you take a look at that. It's all under the national security umbrella. It's not just a situation we have to stay in silos anymore. And if we're going to have a good national security posture, then it has to be one that puts the right people out front in the right places, and it all has to be seen as national security. It shouldn't matter where the money comes from on that. And I think, you can correct me if I'm wrong, that this is something we can look at not just in Afghanistan and Iraq, but in all of the places where Mr. Issa indicated that we may be posturing in the future, whether it be Yemen, Somalia, Sudan, or whatever, is to look at the right mix of people, what's inherently governmental there, and how we get those personnel in place. Are you going to have time to do all of that by the time your report needs to be issued?
Well, we're challenged, and we're putting out a report this December with our legislative proposals so that they can be considered, or very early January, so they can be considered by the Congress. In answer to your point, which is accurate, if the State, and Commissioner Green may want to amplify, if the State Department doesn't receive the kinds of funds that they're not receiving now, no matter what their capability is, they're not going to get the job done because they're not going to have the staff, the people, the resources to award and oversee contracts. If part of that mechanism is to utilize funds that have been saved in defense or have defense provide certain functions that they already do, that will greatly contribute to the State's objectives.
Yeah, I think that's basically accounting, right? If in fact you take the money that's saved in the Department of Defense and it goes to Secretary of State and temporarily they can't do it themselves, they're just subcontracting back to the Department of Defense. You know, and maybe they have to work some arrangement on a memorandum of agreement or something where the resources are at least put in the right place,
Right.
and then temporarily spent back on that basis to cover it. Because I know there's a lot of maneuvering between the secretaries here, who's going to pay for what. It's what budget this comes out of. But the fact of the matter is we've somehow, Mr. Chairman, got to transcend that and say, look, if you're going to save X amount of dollars, and it ought to be in the Secretary of State's division, and it temporarily DOD has to fulfill it, then let them do some contract or something on that basis, but at least set up the mechanism where we're transitioning on a long-range plan. We have a plan to get where we eventually need to be. Because we cannot have the number of contractors, private contractors out there doing inherently governmental functions because it's not the right message to send, because there's no check on liability, there's no accountability, and frankly, it's rife for fraud and abuse and overspending and inefficiency. So it's a big challenge that you have. It's one that we put in the legislation for you to do. I thank you for starting off on that way, and we'll support you any way we can, I suspect. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Let me thank the gentleman from Massachusetts, and also to thank him for his work in this area. And of course, we still have a long way to go, but I want to let him know he's really got us going. And I think the serious questions are being raised. That's the reason why I think this hearing is just so important. I now yield to the gentleman from Virginia, Congressman Connolly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I may, and welcome, gentlemen. Let me pick up on where Mr. Tierney just left off. I find that sometimes the definition of inherently governmental is deceptively simple. Let me ask you both. For example, is the provision of security, ongoing security for U.S. personnel in Iraq, an inherently governmental function in your view?
Well, the simple answer, and I do not mean to be vague, is our perspective, and we have not come down formally on this because it's that important, is to recognize the different types of security. Because you have convoy security, you have distinguished visitor security, and you have static or base security. There haven't been substantial issues or country concerns about base security. There have been issues about convoy security, very significant issues about the use of private security contractors and the like.
Well, your answer certainly comports with my own view that, again, I repeat, deceptively simple. The answer is it depends. There are some security functions that it may be perfectly proper for the government to take over. There may be others we want to continue to contract out for various and sundry reasons. It depends.
That's accurate.
Mr. Green, you would concur?
I would concur. I think the difficulty here, and we haven't talked much about this, is we're really in a box. We've got December 2011 to get all troops out of country, and there really is no alternative. If that is the way we're going, there is no alternative to contractors, whether they are doing inherently governmental things or they're running a mess hall. And, you know, until when and if that decision is modified, we're going to do it with contractors.
Mm-hmm. Let me ask a broader, well, just on contracting. One estimate of the number of security folks we're going to need, the State Department is going to need in taking over new responsibilities, is they probably need somewhere in the vicinity of 6,000 or 7,000 contractors.
Correct.
You would agree with that number?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
And how are they coming along in securing contracts to secure 6,000 to 7,000 private contractors for security?
You know, I don't know.
I think I can assist with that. They have several solicitations that are in the works because of the growth, and the solicitations generally go towards existent companies that with a proven record, contractors, because they have confidence in working with them, and in a very short turnaround, you tend to go with those organizations. They try to utilize competition, but it's not as broad a base as might be desirable simply because of the expedient nature of the mission.
Are we confident that that there won't be any holes in the security apparatus because of contracting mechanisms or delays in the signing of contracts and the execution thereof?
Well, the execution's interesting because the way they're aligning is right now, you know, there remains, using Iraq, it could fit Afghanistan, I guess, but there are about 50 military bases, forward bases and military bases, that'll go to maybe 14 or 15, counting those that are there for the Department of Defense for foreign military sales. By necessity, what they've done is cut back their diplomatic capability to travel throughout the country. So one of the implications and outcomes,
They being our State Department.
State Department, is they will not do the diplomatic mission to the extent they would like to, because they even with 7,000, they have cut back dramatically, for example, in the number of what they call PRTs, or the provincial teams that build diplomacy and build relationships and provide assistance. That's been totally pulled back to their 4 existing bases because of security. And that's with 7,000 additional security individuals. If they tried to keep it the way that they'd had it, I have no idea what that number would be, but it would be substantially more, maybe double.
At least speaking for this member, Mr. Thibeault, what you just said is stunning. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, gentlemen, for yielding back. I now recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Congressman Quigley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I suppose this is as good a time as any and a good issue and location as any to say that I have a hard time disagreeing with my colleague, the gentleman from Ohio, about this issue. It's extraordinarily frustrating, and we should care about the issue wherever it is in the United States, the fundamental issue of that which makes our country safer. And the fact is this transition has to work, and the Department of Defense has to help, because we are forgetting the issue closer to home here. And if I might indulge, we have heard of threats everywhere and would-be bombers. Well, the most recent one was in Chicago, and the would-be bomber placed the bomb a block from my house. So I can't help notice that the work that really matters, first and foremost, is taking place right here in this country. And the success that's taken place in stopping this is good police work right here in this country. So you'll have to forgive me if I'm frustrated that the Department of Defense seems to have the mindset that staying in Iraq for a lifetime is going to somehow make us safer. This has to work. The current strategy of stalling and making this difficult is counterproductive, and in the long run makes us less safe. But to the extent you gentlemen are willing to chime in the end, even if this transition works to the extent that you are talking about, do you really think the dynamics inside Iraq are going to be different 5 years from now or 10 years from now, so that someone else from the outside won't have to play a big role?
That's certainly a question that intellectually I'm sure all of us have thought about. It's not within our charter, certainly. One of the great frustrations that State feels and Defense feels. The Chairman has remarked to it, as well as Secretary Gates and folks within the State Department, is the unsettled nature of the Iraqi government. There are many, many decisions that cannot be made until there is a government. I can speculate till the cows come home when that might happen and the difficulties in achieving that. But the fact remains, until that government is settled, there are many, many decisions that cannot be made between State and the Defense Department. And I don't want to leave the impression that Defense is being uncooperative. We talked the one issue, the log cap memo, I'll call it. That we don't understand why that has taken so long. But in other areas, there's been significant cooperation. And in fact, I briefed General Austin about 3 days before he left here to take over command in Iraq, and I told him, I said, you know, if this fails, it's not state failing, it's the country failing. And that's what it is. So we've got to work together, state, defense, and any other, USAID, any other departments and agencies that have a stake in this have got to lean forward in the foxhole and make sure it happens the way our country is set up for it to happen.
And I might add that as part of your question, I think it is reflective today of the environment related to security as we pull out, which is in some cases increased given the fact that we're at fewer locations. There's no indication that that's going to cease when we turn simply to a diplomatic approach in 2011. We'd all like that. I mean, I think everyone would like that. But there's no indication. Therefore, the State Department, as a good steward of safety, contracting, and the like, if you look at the numbers now on their 4 permanent locations they're building out right now, and they're building it out, somewhere between 2/3 and 75% of each one of those locations are security people. And the number of diplomats, and 2 of them, because they had to cut them in half because of budgets, you can't cut the security, are 20. So you have at embassy branch offices or consulates 20 people doing what State Department would like to do, and several hundred individuals doing security. And that's, I think, reflective of your concern.
I agree. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you very much. Now recognize gentlewoman from California, Congresswoman Speer.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen, for your service. I'm somewhat dumbfounded by what you have presented to us today. In some respects, we're just rearranging deck chairs, it would appear, and substituting a group of contractors to do what our military has been doing, and the contractors will be overseen by a State Department that doesn't have the oversight, authority, or capacity to do the job. Is that a fair analysis?
Well, I think the State Department would say they're working very hard to try to build that capability, but I think that would be a concern that they have that, because historically they've been, to call it just like it is, they've been slow to provide the kinds of contract oversight. They've been very responsive, but it's been a situation where their staff limitations have created challenges, and to pry out 4 or 5 additional contracting officer representatives to do the kind of work they do, which is to make sure a security company is satisfying their contract requirements, has been a challenge. So it'll continue to be a challenge.
Has the State Department ever had similar responsibilities in any other country?
No, not like this. I mentioned early on that I participated in the transition from the Coalition Provisional Authority to the new embassy in 2004. And obviously, when the Soviet Union went down and the State Department created a number of new embassies, those were big jobs. But they have never, in my estimation, and I think others would support this, they have never faced this kind of a task in such a hostile, or I'll say non-benign environment. So you're in a high threat area, and that's something we don't know what's going to happen in December of 2011 with the insurgency. What are they going to do? We've already seen periodic upticks in threats. In fact, the embassy compound took some rockets not long ago, and I was told that one of them clipped the DCM's residence. So it is a high-threat environment. complicated by the fact that they are going to have to take over many, many, many missions which they have no experience doing.
No core competency. That's not their job.
Well, it's not their job. No.
So we're giving State Department a job which they don't have core competency in, that they don't have the experience or expertise, and we're telling them to go out and do this. And by the way, you're going to have 6,000 or 7,000 contractors under the auspices of the United States operating in country.
Well,
you have to add to that, because we're talking security contractors. If they're left holding the logistical support bag, they're going to have they don't have a present capability in theater. They have no experience. They've relied on the Army. Right now, because in advance of this, I pulled down the number, there are 36,300 KBR employees that are providing logistical support.
Excuse me one moment. Let me interrupt you, and I apologize. That is a sole source contract to KB.
Exactly.
So no competitive bidding.
Exactly. But there are 36,300. That number will come down from 50 bases to maybe 14 locations. But if you do the math, 30% times 40,000, I could come up with another 10,000 that they would have to manage if, in fact, the Army doesn't provide that support. And the Army has become, from a management perspective, not necessarily a contracting, but from a management perspective, they're much better than they were. But to take it away from them and have the State Department start all over just doesn't make sense.
And in fairness,
I'm sorry, my time is about up. Let me just ask one more question. Is this going to cost the taxpayers of this country more money?
Absolutely.
How much more money?
It's really indeterminable, but very substantial amounts of money, because there's going to have to be some kind of a transition, and especially if competition results in a different contractor. You might save some money in competition, but you're going to be introducing the need for the transition. Our position is that starting in 2011, they should use Log Cap 4. They should award a solicitation, bring competition in. If KBR wins it, great. If DynCorp or Fluor wins it, great. But there's a mechanism. But the longer we draw this out, just like the continuation of Log Cap 3, the longer you draw it out, the more likely you're going to get a letter from the Department of Defense or from State saying, we don't have time to use competition, let's extend this sole source contract. That's the risk.
And we better get this right, because we're going to be doing it in Afghanistan in not the too distant future.
Right. Thank you very much. The gentlewoman's time has expired. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from North Carolina, Congressman McHenry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And at this time, I'd like to yield the balance of my time to the ranking member, Mr. Ison.
I thank the gentleman. I want to follow up on something, because I think it wasn't intended, I'm sure, to be part of this hearing, but it now is. The gentleman from Ohio, I believe, implied that he needed to get General Petraeus and the Secretary of Defense in here, if I understood correctly, because, the military doesn't want to leave, and they want the State Department to fail. Mr. Green, you've been on both sides of this. Do you see any malice or any legitimacy to the thought that either DOD or State wants the other to fail?
No, I do not. And somebody maybe can find it, but I see no evidence that the military wants to stay in Iraq. I served 2 tours in Vietnam, and I was happy to leave.
There's a reason you count down those days.
That's right. But I think that there is cooperation. Why Log Cap? Why this one request has been held up? I don't think we need to build everything, the whole relationship, around whether that one request was held up or not. Yes, it's a major one. But there's been a lot of other cooperation at the working level between State and the commands, and certainly in country. So,
no, I'm sure
simple answer is no.
Yeah. And you'd say no also, I'm sure.
I would say no also. No, I agree with that statement. There's no indication at all that the United States Army wants to remain. In fact, they're pulling troops out, you know, in a manner in which we might say pause in terms of some of this support requirement that the State Department needs. But in my mind, and maybe others' minds, I think there's a question about does the Army really want to provide the kind of support that State needs? And that, I think, is the stovepipe situation that you've already talked about.
Well, and the gentleman from Massachusetts alluded to the question that some of this seems to be funding fight and the question of nobody wanting to spend their resources unless they're fully funded and so on. And let me just put it in a context. You know, we've all been to other host countries, and I'll just use Japan as a good example. In Japan, we have a large military presence, and that large military presence, they're not just our host, but they're our financial host. And so when we view our military support there, we view it as fully funded by the host country. In the case of Iraq, should this committee look into, and Afghanistan, because you're absolutely right, we're going down that road, that the funding should be, even if it's U.S. dollars, should be hosted there. So regardless of who goes there, they must go there to get the money. In other words, if the Army were looking at cycling through people, or the Air Force or anybody else, or State, the money is there, they tap that money in host country. If they don't provide the support, if it goes to a contractor or it goes to a State Department employee, they use those funds. Would that movement of dollars to be independent of who does it allow for all the agencies to maybe play better in the sandbox?
If such a thing was remotely possible, that they could fund it, I know in Afghanistan, if you look at the monies we're spending now, the country has no ability to fund it.
Oh, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that we expect that the money would come from the host country.
Right.
But when it comes from the host country, the Army, Navy, Air Force, everybody sort of competes for, okay, can I get a slot in there? Is that slot meaningful? And I know I'm going to be paid for it. If we move it to, because look, we have an appropriation system. It's stovepipe for the most part by committees. But if we looked at Iraq and we had Iraq funding as a standalone, and we made it independent of whether the Army or the State Department or the Department of Interior got the money initially, but the money was there, and we did an authorization for that. Now, it's basically still State Department money, but it wouldn't be State Department money in the large barrel. It would be Iraq funding for State activities. If we did that, wouldn't that eliminate some of this problem of people being reticent to pay for something unless they're going to get paid back because they see it as taking from other mission?
I think, if I understand your premise, I think something like that was recommended by Secretary Gates to Secretary Clinton. And as I understand the proposal, and I don't understand it terribly well, that each would put money in a pot commensurate with their responsibilities to do certain things. As you know better than I, State's budget is minuscule compared to DOD. DOD rounds off more at the end of the year than State has to spend other than in foreign assistance, which can't be touched for this. I haven't given it a lot of thought, but if there were an appropriation, a pot of money, and the State Department didn't have to contribute to that, because that's where I think they have a difficulty. But if there were a pot of money, I think it would eliminate some of this back and forth, because as someone mentioned before, you know, Gates is going to save $100 million, but he's going to let the services keep that to apply it to new weapon systems and personnel increases. So unless somebody says, no, he can't do that, that's what his plan is.
Gentleman from North Carolina's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I would ask that the witnesses expand on that in writing, and that perhaps we flesh out some of the possibilities together to recommend to the President.
Without objection.
Thank you.
So ordered. I now recognize the gentlewoman from California, Congresswoman Watson.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I'm sitting here very, very frustrated because we got into a war that was not declared by Congress. The Secretary of State said, if you break it, you own it. And there is no way, and I want this for the record, there is no way that we're going to win a war of a particular cultural and traditional quality with guns and bullets. Now we're discussing the State Department, whose mission is completely different. The mission of the State Department is to work on the foreign policy of our government and the post we're in, the nation we're in, diplomatically. So I think the responsibility, and I'm saying this to the Commission to deliver to your members and to the President, we need to have the military, and this committee needs to do the oversight, provide for the military security and the security of our missions as long as we're there. We have not won a war. We are trying to have a sovereign nation use a diplomatic system what they're experimenting with, but we do not need to take on that burden through the State Department. So what I'm asking is, will you recommend strongly again in your next report that the military take over securing with the number of forces that are needed as long as we're there? And my friends, we're going to be there forever. It's a completely different part of the world with different goals and different ways of running their own nations. We have to understand that. And so my question to you is, can we put forth a contingency plan for the State Department to be able to have the kind of security and to fulfill their mission that will be funded through the resources of DOD?
Under the current budgetary and fiscal guidelines, you're asking, can we? That's not doable, because there's
what is not doable?
Separate streams of funds and the like. This committee or an organization.
Well, what are we asking the State Department to do? We're asking the State Department to take over the responsibilities of the military. Correct?
In many cases, that's absolutely
I ran a mission. It was a tiny mission over in Micronesia. We contracted out our security. We hired a former Marine who headed up a security company, and because of the size of the mission, it worked. But we're in a war zone as determined by the last administration, and we still have troops there. So can we, using that kind of line of thinking, ask the Department of Defense to increase the budget for securing that mission that we're still involved in?
We would support, and it's stated in our testimony, a requirement that the Department of Defense more timely and effectively sit with the State Department, go through those functions that they ought to be doing, and that there be a requirement that they do those functions. From a budgetary viewpoint, the question then remaining is who funds it.
Okay, let me take that off the table and ask the chairman of this committee if we can develop a letter stating just what has been mentioned and send it to the President, Commander-in-Chief, and to DOD and to the State Department, because the State Department does not have the skill sets to provide the kind of security. They contract it out, usually. So the subject matter of this whole hearing is the oversight responsibility that we have. And I think we ought to send a letter saying, let DOD do what it's assigned to do so the State Department can carry out its mission and provide the funding.
I understand the lady's request. What we do here from the second panel and make a decision as to how we move from here. Thank you. Gentlewoman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Tennessee, Congressman Dunkins, for 5 minutes.
Well, Mr. Chairman, because I was in other meetings, I wasn't able to get here in time, and so I'm going to yield my questioning period to Mr. Issa.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman from Tennessee, and I believe this is so important. Our staff has worked hard on more questions than we'll ever ask, and I would ask if both of the gentlemen would be willing to answer some additional ones in writing.
Absolutely.
Certainly.
They'll probably be the ones less of interest to some people, but more of interest to the staff that in detail would like to produce a report afterwards. I'm on leave of absence from the Foreign Affairs Committee, so I have to know my limitations and I have to remember the jurisdiction of that committee. But we have 1,600 people in 6 major facilities in Iraq in the current plan, roughly. Is that right? That's the number that I've got in front of me for the embassy and branches or consulates.
The diplomatic side?
Diplomatic side, yes.
That's
probably pretty close.
So part of the need for a total of 7,700 people, or roughly 6,100 contractors if the fit doesn't hit the shan in the weeks after military begins pulling out, is because of the size of our mission, the largest mission anywhere in the world. Is that right?
It's both the static security of the embassy and the 4 other posts, plus the personal security details that would be there and available to escort and protect the diplomatic staff.
Now, in my time going around the world in the Foreign Affairs Committee, one of the things that I observed regularly was that USAID typically only goes if it's safe enough, and in the Horn of Africa, in a number of other areas, it usually begins phasing over to the military to do aid projects if it's an unsecure situation. Iraq has fit that. Afghanistan fits that. This is a place in which the military contributes far more to the construction projects and so on than the State Department. Am I to understand that this plan envisions USAID taking over construction and activities of that sort, development, and the democracy movement, and doing so with this size force as it does not do in most other areas?
I think that certainly the AID mission, when it comes to reconstruction and stability operations, will increase, because to the degree that we would do SERP-like projects, they won't be SERP, but AID would take over those to the degree they have the capability and that their implementing partners have the capability. You're absolutely right. The AID staff, if there are unsecured areas, they don't tend to go out, but they count on their implementing partners. And very frankly, most of the implementing partners don't want that linkage with the Defense Department. They don't want a flag out there because they believe it attracts the wrong kind of attention.
Sure, I understand that, and that's always controversial, whose signs goes up and who gets credit, and there's always some sheikh who would prefer the credit over anybody else. Actually, I remember in the latter days of Jimmy Carter, when we sent free wheat to Russia, to Soviet Union, and they proceeded to paint over anything that said U.S. and put good made in Russia on it so that their people would think they were being fed by themselves. I guess things never change. The question I have, it goes back to that self-inflicted wound. We have missions of various size, Marines and seconded military personnel, military attachés. Egypt, for example, has a large amount of our military people that work in and for the ambassador. Is there any inherent reason that Iraq is preventing military assets from being, I use the word seconded, but assigned to the ambassador for purposes of many of these duties? Is there anything that has absolutely been negotiated away so that would be impossible?
Not that I'm aware of. In fact,